hello, very beautiful community. Mr. Peskov, the spokesperson for the tyrant in the Kremlin, has said that the special military operation has now become a war. And that that's happened because of the West's sustained support for Ukraine, which for the Kremlin is excessive and for us is insufficient. And that has forced Russia into taking a much more maximalist view, especially as something we've talked about ad nauseum dramatizes Ukraine's war on Russian soil. Right? As that dramatizes, the Kremlin has to appreciate that it's going to take more and more damage the more it perpetuates the war. And this means it has to take a more maximalist conception of it. Now, the questions for us are, what does Peskov have in mind when he says it? 2, how screwed is Putin? 3, what's Putin going to do? And 4, what would the ideal version of Putin do? Because Putin is pretty washed out, having been in power for over a quarter century. For Peskov, it's actually not as radical a statement as it has been made out to be by some media, because it's done the rounds in global news. Peskov is simply thinking, we've been saying SMO, 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 war, SMO, SMO, war, and now we're saying war. And of course, an initiator of this was Mr. Putin himself, who much earlier on in the war started to throw in the word war instead of special military operation. How screwed is Putin? Here, the answer is a kind of bad news for pro-Ukraine folks, in the sense that all of the problems Putin faces, the crisis in Crimea, discontent about his internet censorship, the fuel crisis, the scary trends for the Russian economy, the sort of bubbling up of not yet politicized but palpable discontent about the state of affairs, that's both a kind of disquiet and a kind of fatigue. All of that, and we could name many more factors, are factors that would make a moment of crisis for the Putin regime much more existential and much more likely to lead to his demise. But these are not factors that are likely to cause such a crisis. So they are compounding factors, not triggering factors. If a situation arises in which there is a crack in the regime, together with bottom-up mobilization politically, and a present leadership figure who both critiques and offers an alternate vision of the future that gives the population confidence that taking action, even if it's risky, could lead to alternate outcomes, right? If that situation obtains, then these compounding factors would make it much more dramatic and terminal for the regime. But these are not factors that could themselves, just by being exacerbated, making the war on Russian soil even worse for the Kremlin, cause an existential crisis for the regime. So compounding factors, not triggering factors. What's Putin going to do? Putin has 2 commitments, and here it's important to say that we have a controversy online about how and whether we should talk about what's in Putin's head. And the answer to this controversy that I have is simple: quality. You basically say, we talk rot much of the time and we talk about what's in Putin's head, but that's not an argument against talking about what's in Putin's head if you do it well. Right? There's a certain kind of tendency among certain academic experts to say, well, it's not quite an appropriate field of expertise, and so we should sort of leave it out. If you're having a conflict about the fence with your neighbor, you're not going to leave out what's in the damn head of your neighbor, because you're going to try to understand that as a way of understanding what your conflict is about, right? What is the neighbor going to do? Is he going to throw water balloons at me, or is he going to throw grenades over the fence, right? So you got to try to get at what's in your neighbor's head, because that is a normatively impeccable enterprise. It's not an objection to that enterprise that, oh, we're really bad at it and we're likely to get it wrong. That's not a reason to not do it well, not try to do it well. So there are two things in my interpretation in Putin's head. One is, I don't want to change anything. Please, status quo. Please, status quo. Please let me persist with the status quo without needing to change anything. Putin is risk averse. Putin is conservative. And Putin is scared about making wrong decisions. We'll say something more about how that's a product of him being washed out by corrupt power. But that's Putin. So Putin wants the preservation of the status quo, which means we're taking a lot of damage, but we're going to still try to keep putting pressure on Ukraine, hoping we cause a political crisis there, or we are the beneficiaries of a political crisis in the West that dissolves NATO, dissolves Western democracies, or some of them, or dissolves the West's support for Ukraine. Second thought in Putin's mind that's quite embedded in my interpretation is the thought that while I don't want to do anything, if I do have to do something, I'm going to escalate rather than make concessions. What does that mean? It could mean anything from a military mobilization to a political mobilization to a low threshold challenge of Article 5 in the Baltics to a sort of quasi-deniable hybrid attack on some weapons factory or storage place in a NATO country like Poland to put in pressure on Lukashenko. It doesn't matter. There's a palette of options. What I will say is that Putin will be tempted to take one of them rather than make concessions if he has to do something. And what I'll also say is that the Putin regime does not have the state capacity to effectively evaluate these options and say, well, we've got 7 or 17 and number 4 and number 11 are the best. They don't have the capacity to make good quality decisions about this. A quick aside at this point, by the way, there's a kind of subconscious tendency for us to think that authoritarian regimes have really good state capacity because they can get things done. That's rarely true. Very few generalizations in the so-called social sciences beautiful community, but that's rarely true. Because while we do have a crisis of state capacity in the West, Putin's is worse when it comes to his domestic politics. In domestic politics, and that's partly why he's so interested in foreign politics, because there he can at least do more. In domestic politics, Putin often presses the accelerator, changes gear, and not much happens. So get that truth about authoritarian regimes. Okay, aside over. So Putin is stuck in the status quo mode. I want to preserve the status quo. I don't want to do anything radically different. But if I have to do something different, I am going to escalate. Okay. Now, lastly, let's look at what a sort of malign advisor with Putin's best interests, the best interests of the preservation of his political career at heart. That person, if I try to occupy that role at least, would be very frustrated now because I've been shouting from the rooftops that Putin should have taken the least worst, from the Kremlin point of view, deal that Trump had to offer, because that would have led to a partial reintegration of Russia into the West and an increase in Russia's capacity to undermine Western democracy, which is essentially Putin's theory of victory over us. But that required boldness, it required freshness, and it required vision. None of these things are things that Putin has in abundance because of the degree to which he's been washed out by power. Right? Putin's political thinking now is passive, defensive, fearful, corrosive. It's open to boldness when he feels it's absolutely necessary. And he does feel it's necessary because, don't forget, in his mind, he's still fighting a defensive war in Ukraine, a defensive war against the West to preserve his regime security at home. That's not the only cause, but that's central. But he's a pretty washed-out political thinker who doesn't have the freshness, if you like, to jump on a moving skateboard. He doesn't have that capacity, Machiavellian capacity, to get lucky, to make something of one's luck, to make oneself lucky. So I'd be frustrated with Putin for a missed opportunity. if I were that kind of malign advisor. Now, what would I say? I would say, look at bringing the war on Ukraine to a halt with a deal overseen by Trump and credited to Trump, and maybe try to push that along as much as you can by saying we really want to stop this, while actually being open to stopping this, but also at the same time pretending to be as nuts as you possibly can be, threatening nuclear war left, right, and center, and engaging all kinds of B-level escalation. So the things I mentioned earlier about an attack on some site in Poland or an attack on the Baltics, that would be an A-level escalation, right? What are B-level of escalations? Can we do something we haven't done yet in Ukraine? Could we find something like that, right? So some kind of escalation combined, but not A-grade escalation, combined with a determination, right, to persuade Trump that you're genuinely open to stopping the war while genuinely being open to stopping the war. Stage A. Stage B, start readying folders for some kind of escalation or warlike activity in the next couple of years. That does not necessarily have to be Ukraine-based, but could be a challenge, a low-threshold challenge to Article 5 in the Baltics, right? Because halting the war in Ukraine, of course, could give you the benefit of a partial reintegration of the West, some of the benefits of this missed opportunity we've just discussed, right? But that doesn't mean you no longer need escalation, and perhaps more than just escalation, for domestic regime security. So you have to then start preparing a foreign adventure of some kind in the near future that does not have to be in Ukraine, right? So obviously, we're not wanting to occupy the head of that advisor ourselves because they're malignly motivated, but that's something like where they might start. Lots of love and talk very soon, beautiful community. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I have got married, beautiful community, and it was really like this because we thought my health wouldn't be up to it even a couple of days out. But I made it, it happened, and it was magical, and I'm going to share some photos, beautiful community. So I now have a wife who has stolen all my audio gear. So that's what happens when you get married. She's recording a podcast for the BBC, and for a month, all my audio gear is born. So be very careful about all these things. Marriage, you just never know what might happen, beautiful community. Lots of love, talk soon.